Welcome to RJ Academy, and today I will teach you Class 10 Political Science Chapter Power Sharing. I am so pumped to be your guide for this explainer today. Seriously, if you pay close attention and master the material we're covering, I can absolutely guarantee you're going to score full marks on this topic. Think of this roughly 10-minute review as your ultimate study companion. We're going to break down some pretty complex ideas into perfectly structured, super easy to remember notes. So grab a pen, get focused, and let's go secure those marks.
So here's our game plan. These 5 pillars form the ultimate blueprint for your exam, and they'll give us a clear, predictable roadmap to master the whole chapter. First, we'll look at the tale of 2 compositions. Second, Sri Lanka's case study on majoritarianism. Third, Belgium's accommodation model. Fourth, the big question of why power sharing prevents conflict. And finally, the 4 forms of power sharing.
Okay, let's dive into this. Pillar 1, the tale of 2 compositions, featuring Belgium and Sri Lanka.
To kick things off, we're looking at a tale of 2 nations, Belgium and Sri Lanka. Now, both of these countries had highly diverse populations living inside their borders, but as you're about to see, they handled that diversity in completely opposite ways. To really understand their choices, we've got to nail down a key exam term first: ethnic composition. It's basically a social division based on shared culture, language, or identity. To make it super simple, just imagine your school is hosting this massive cultural potluck, or maybe think about your different school clubs. You've got the sports kids, the theater kids, the robotics kids. These diverse groups bring their own unique traits, right? They have their own slang, their own inside jokes, their own traditions, but they are all sharing the exact same common space, which is your school. Well, countries are exactly like that, just on a much, much larger scale.
Let's check out Belgium first. 59% of the population lived in the Flemish region and spoke Dutch, which made them the clear majority in the country. Meanwhile, 40% lived in the Walloon region and spoke French, and a tiny 1% spoke German. But, oh man, here is the massive catch that caused all the tension. In the capital city of Brussels, the demographics were completely flipped. In the capital, the richer, relatively more educated French minority actually made up 80% of the population. That left the country's Dutch majority as a minority in the capital. You can easily imagine the kind of resentment and tension that created.
Now contrast that with Sri Lanka. It's an island nation just south of India. Their ethnic composition was dominated by a very clear majority. 74% of the population were Sinhala speakers. The main minority group was Tamil speakers, making up 18%. And hey, make sure to jot this detail down for your notes. This Tamil minority was actually split into 2 subgroups. You had the Sri Lankan Tamils who were natives, and the Indian Tamils, whose forefathers were brought over as plantation workers.
All right, quick checkpoint. Let's make sure you're sharp on those map facts, because they love to pop up in exams. Belgium shares its borders with how many countries of Europe? Think about it for a second. Got it? The answer is 4. France, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Definitely keep those tiny geographical details locked in.
Let's move to and see how this builds into our second exam pillar, Sri Lanka's case study on majoritarianism.
So, what happens when a country looks at its diverse ethnic composition and just decides to completely ignore the needs of its minority? Well, spoiler alert, it leads to some pretty devastating historical consequences. Sri Lanka adopted a policy called majoritarianism. This is a huge exam definition. It's the belief that the majority community should be able to rule a country in whichever way it wants, totally disregarding the wishes and needs of the minority. Think of it like a playground. The biggest group of kids decides, hey, we're going to hog the swings, we're taking over the basketball court, and we're making up rules that only benefit us. They completely bully the smaller groups out of playing. That is majoritarianism in a nutshell.
Let's trace how this toxic playground behavior actually played out in real life. In 1956, the Sri Lankan government passed an act recognizing only Sinhala as the official language, completely ignoring the 18% who spoke Tamil. Over the subsequent years, the Tamils felt incredibly alienated. Government jobs and university positions openly favored Sinhala speakers, and a new constitution protected Buddhism as the state religion. Driven into a corner, the Tamils spent later decades demanding regional autonomy and equal rights, but they were denied. The tragic climax to all of this deep distrust and unmanaged diversity eventually erupted into a devastating, violent civil war, a perfect warning story of what not to do.
Time for another practice question. Which of these was not a provision of the 1956 Act? Was it A, B, C, or D? Well, if you selected D, that provinces were given autonomy, you are totally exam ready. Autonomy is exactly what the Tamils were begging for, and it is exactly what they were ruthlessly denied by the majority.
And this brilliantly illustrates our transition into the third pillar, Belgium's accommodation model.
We've just seen the tragedy of Sri Lanka. But Belgium? Belgium chose a totally contrasting, peaceful approach to structural diversity. They proved that conflicts are definitely not inevitable if you're actually willing to share power. The leaders in Belgium realized, hey, to keep this country together, we have to respect everyone's feelings. So between 1970 and 1993, they literally amended their constitution 4 separate times to create a system that worked. First, they mandated an equal number of French and Dutch ministers in the central government. Remember, the Dutch were the majority in the whole country, but they agreed to equal representation. Second, state governments were given real independent power. They weren't just taking orders from the central government anymore. Third, they created a separate government for the capital city of Brussels. There, the French majority agreed to equal representation, perfectly matching the Dutch compromise at the central level. And finally, they created a highly unique community government to handle cultural affairs.
Let's test your memory on that very last point. What exactly is the purpose of Belgium's community government? Think back. It is a specialized government elected by people belonging to just one language group, no matter where they happen to live in Belgium. And it has the power to manage specific cultural, educational, and language issues. It's brilliant because it ensures nobody ever feels culturally erased.
Now you are going to want to remember this because this comparison is an absolute goldmine for your exam notes. It directly evaluates the two countries. Under approach, Sri Lanka chose majoritarianism while Belgium chose accommodation. Under power sharing, Sri Lanka centralized everything to the Sinhala majority, whereas Belgium distributed power fairly across all its linguistic groups. And most importantly, look at the long-term consequences. Sri Lanka suffered distrust, instability, and a terrible civil war. Belgium achieved long-lasting peace, stability, and unity. Moving right along to Pillar 4. Why exactly does power sharing prevent conflict?
Okay, so we've seen the proof that it works, but now we need to answer the big why. Why does sharing power actually prevent a country from falling apart? There are 2 main categories of reasons you really need to know for your exam. If a question asks why power sharing is desirable, you've got to split your answer into prudential and moral reasons. A prudential reason is all about the practical, calculating choice. It literally reduces the possibility of social conflict between groups. And less conflict? That means long-term political stability. A moral reason, on the other hand, is the ethical choice. Power sharing is the very basic spirit of democracy. A democratic government is only legitimate when citizens acquire a stake in the system through their own active participation.
So the crucial point is, selfishness in politics completely backfires. The tyranny of the majority is not just oppressive for the minority, it often brings ruin to the majority as well. Even the biggest playground bullies eventually suffer when the refusal to share ruins the game for literally everyone. It's just like how the refusal to share power in Sri Lanka ruined the peace and stability for the Sinhala majority too. Let's see if you were paying close attention to the vocabulary. Which reason for power sharing emphasizes that it is the very spirit of democracy? Is it prudential or is it moral? The answer is moral, because it relates directly to the inherent ethical spirit of what makes a democracy legitimate in the first place.
All right, final stretch. Pillar 5, the 4 forms of power sharing.
Excellent work so far. You are almost at the finish line, and you're getting completely ready to absolutely ace this test. Now that we know why we should share power, we need to outline exactly what the 4 modern forms of power sharing actually look like. The first 2 forms relate directly to government structure. Form 1 is horizontal distribution. This is when power is shared among different organs of government placed at the exact same level, so the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. None of them have unlimited power, which creates an awesome system of checks and balances. Form 2 is vertical distribution. This is when power is shared among governments at different tiers, from top to bottom. Think of a central government, a state government, and a local municipality. This vertical top-to-bottom sharing is what we call federalism.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how power sharing extends way beyond just formal government structures. Form 3 is power sharing among social groups. This means deliberately giving socially weaker sections a voice in administration. Great examples are India's system of reserved constituencies or Belgium's community government. Finally, Form 4 is sharing power among political parties and pressure groups. When no single party gets a clear majority, they share power by forming a coalition government. It also means giving groups like trade unions or farmers a real way to influence government policy without even being politicians themselves. Here is your final checkpoint question before we wrap up. Why is power sharing among the legislature, executive, and judiciary specifically called horizontal distribution?
Well, it's because these three organs are placed at the exact same horizontal level to exercise different powers, allowing them to constantly keep an eye on each other and maintain a perfect balance.
That brings us to the end of our explainer. We've seen how brilliant models like what Belgium pulled off can literally save a nation. But it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought. As our modern societies become even more diverse, will these structural models of power sharing always be enough to prevent a country from breaking apart? It's definitely something to think about as you review these concepts. The notes of this chapter is in the description.